Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm coming back to this theme of detail. Why are we in Zimbabwe stuck? I think it is important to understand what is it we want to do, how it should be done, who is supposed to do what. Detail is important. Detail is everything. And those who have failed to pay attention to detail have paid dearly for that folly. Let's just listen to this video of Nelson Chamisa. This was just before the 2023 election, last year's elections.
Zimbabwe nokuti hakuna munhu anomira kana denga raronga plan. Denga raronga plan, denga harifoiri. Plan yaMwari haifoiri. Ini ndatanga kugadzira cabinet. There is no way we are not going to form a new cabinet. There is no way we are not going to have a celebration. There is no way we are not going to have an inauguration. Let's start preparing for our inauguration. Let's start preparing for our celebration.
Well, that was a promise, some would say, some promise. Nelson Chamisa and company were absolutely confident that he was going to win the 2023 elections. It didn't happen. And not only that, many people still believe in him, regardless of the fact that he promised them a lot of things, that Triple C was going to win big, and he was going to form the new cabinet. He was preparing for it. He was even roping in God himself. This was God's plan, he claimed. And God does not fail. And many people believed it. When the election results came, Zanu PF blatantly rigged those elections, as many people had warned against participating in the flawed elections. And yet, the same individuals who had believed him still continue to believe him. So what is it that Nelson has got to do before they can finally say, stop, what is happening here? Detail, like I say, is everything. Those who fail to pay attention to detail are doomed to fail. And we in Zimbabwe have been independent now 43 years. And last year, we had yet another rigged election. We cannot even hold free, fair, and credible elections, even after 43 years of independence. That is something that people should be concerned about and seriously say, what's wrong? Who do you want to ask that question if you yourself are refusing to answer, to ask it? It is relevant. It is a relevant question. We are not going to get out of this hole until we answer such questions, until we pay attention to such such problems. Sweeping them under the carpet is not going to solve anything. Chamisa promised that he was going to win the 2018 election with the same brash arrogance. He claimed that he had stringent measures to stop Zanu PF rigging those elections in 2018. But we know he didn't. Zanu PF went ahead and rigged the elections. What we need to understand here is actually very simple. People should understand what is it exactly that people have been risking their livelihoods, limbs, and many have lost their lives, electing the opposition leaders into power. Like I said, detail is everything. And in this particular case, the truth is, people elected Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends, and have been electing them ever since 1999, on the understanding that they will implement the democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. That was the purpose of the opposition. Forget everything else. That was the primary purpose of electing the opposition. And now, 23 years down the line, you find yourself in a situation where Zanu PF is still blatantly rigging the elections, as they did last year. You've got to go back to the drawing board and saying, okay, we elected the opposition to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. After 23 years, 5 of which, the 2008 to 2013, they were in the government of national unity. And they had the golden opportunity to implement those reforms. We have got now to accept that the opposition have failed to carry out their task. The reason why people risk their lives to elect them, they failed to carry it out. That is what is the rationale here. The failure to look at that is at the heart of why we are stuck. As much as people still appreciate and would claim, and rightly so, that the problem is Zanu PF rigging the elections, it is true. The problem is Zanu PF rigging the elections. But the solution was, as of 1999, that we should elect an opposition that will implement the democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Detail is everything. What the people should have understood, and many of them still do not understand to this day, is what are those reforms? What are those reforms that will stop Zanu PF rigging the elections? 2, who is to implement those reforms? How are they implemented? And most important of all, what are the consequences of failing to implement those reforms? It's only when you have understood those details, answered those detailed questions, that you finally begin to appreciate that the primary purpose of the opposition was to implement the reforms. And after 23 years, Nelson Chamisa and company have failed to carry out that task. The solution is then clear. You need another opposition leaders who will implement those reforms. There is no point in pretending that you can somehow stop Zanu PF rigging the elections and they have good governance without implementing the reforms, without stopping Zanu PF rigging the elections and maintaining and staying in power. It's a contradiction. As I said before, detail is everything. And I think in Zimbabwe, one of our basic problems is that we have not been paying attention to detail. We think we can solve our problems without knowing what the problem is. So that is a contradiction. You can't solve a problem which you do not understand. You've got to understand the problem, understand what the solution is, so that when that solution is failed, you can turn around and say, why has it failed? I restated the primary purpose of the opposition in Zimbabwe since the late 1999 has been to implement the democratic changes necessary to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Because as long as Zanu PF continues to rig the elections and stay in power, we are not going to change anything. Once they've rigged the election, they'll do anything. They do as they please. This idea that somehow we can stop corruption without and still have Zanu PF still in power is just a pie in the sky. That will never happen. People like Emerson Mnangagwa are the godfathers of corruption. They're the ones who are benefiting the most from it. If you don't believe it, Google for yourself now The Gold Mafia, the documentary by Al Jazeera. In there, some of the gold mafia operators will tell you that kept referring to number one. If you listen carefully to the documentary, you will know who number one is. Emerson Mnangagwa himself. And as president, with absolute power, which is what he has, do you seriously think you can stop him benefiting from the corruption? Then says no. Indeed. These last year's elections, Mnangagwa was spending money as if there's no tomorrow. Many people believe Zanu PF and Mnangagwa, between the two of them, probably spent over $5 billion US. Where do you think he got the money from? From the wholesale looting that is taking place. That's where he got it. And so he's using corruption to bankroll his stay in power. If you seriously think we can still have him in power and be able to stop corruption, then, I give up. You're not thinking at all. We need a solution to Zimbabwe's political crisis. The prospects right now of this illegitimate Mnangagwa administration saving its term up to the 2028 elections is daunting. It's unthinkable. And yet, if the truth be told, there is nothing one can see in the horizon there that is stopping them. Nelson Chamisa and this Triple C have completely imploded. While they are fighting among themselves, who is the chief beneficiary? Zanu PF. And without any meaningful reforms between now and 2028, I think it is naive to think 2028 elections will be any different from last year's elections. And so Zanu PF, the prospect of Zanu PF ruling the country post 2028 is real. And unless we fight it, and fight it now, that will wake up in 2028 and Zanu PF is in power, is still in power. Let me restate the primary purpose again of the opposition. it is to implement the democratic reforms necessary to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. This MDC-CCC opposition has been in power, on the political stage at least, these last 23 years. And they failed to implement even one democratic reform. And not only that, they've been participating in flawed elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, and knowing fully well that by participating, they're giving Zanu PF legitimacy. Why? Out of greed. The same reason why they failed to implement even one reform during the GNU. And they've conned the ordinary people into participating in those flawed elections, promising them that the CCC would win, knowing fully well that they wouldn't. The elections are being rigged to give Zanu PF legitimacy. If we are serious about change in Zimbabwe, we should not be looking to Zanu PF. Zanu PF will never reform itself out of office. We should look to the opposition to implement the reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. We should be looking to the opposition to stop participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. That's what we should be looking at. Detail matters. Some people think they can get away without understanding exactly what is going on. Can't. They're just repeating the same mistake over and over again. And by repeating the same mistake, you pay dearly for it. I would like to remind Zimbabweans that the opposition, the people of Zimbabwe, have risked life and limb to elect the opposition into power for the primary purpose of implementing the democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Get that one understood, and we are talking. Until we understand that, we are just wasting our time. This is not rocket science. I really believe that this is not rocket science. Many people who are supporters of the opposition have been clamoring for regime change, for change as part of their slogans for decades. You need to ask yourself, what change have you been asking for? What change have you been asking for? We can't keep on saying regime change without understanding what is it you want to change. And it is at the heart of that understanding. And only when we understand that we can really meaningfully start having this meaningful debate. This cartoon is somebody who is trying to depict the tragic reality in Zimbabwe. The truth of the matter is, when Nelson Chamisa launched his CCC party, all he wanted was for him to be president. That party had no constitution, had no structures, it had no ideology. had no elected officials. And many people warned that as a political party at a national level, that was going to be disastrous. Many Triple C supporters would not accept it, rejected it, ignored it. But the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons why Triple C collapse has been so dramatic is actually because Triple C had serious problems from the word go. It has serious, fundamental problems. It was easy for Savangu to claim that he was the Secretary General of the party because it had no structures, it had no constitution, it had no elected officials. So he could claim anything. Detail matters. And those who refused to accept the need for a structure, a constitution, and so forth, have got to accept now that they made a mistake. One of the weaknesses with Zimbabwean society is that because we don't pay attention to detail, we don't realize when we have made a mistake. And so we keep repeating the same mistake over and over again. Nelson Triple C chariot was doomed from the word go. It was going nowhere. And it should not be surprising to anyone that it actually got nowhere. And the tragedy in Zimbabwe is that there are some people out there who still fail to realize that MDC and Triple C failed. They want to pretend it succeeded. It's been a great success because they're not paying any attention to any detail. Well, you keep on repeating the same mistake. And it is absolutely heartbreaking. 43 years after independence, we, the people in Zimbabwe, are failing to hold free, fair, credible elections. And come 2028, we will have another rigged elections, unless we do something about it. And at the present moment, because we have not been paying attention to detail, the chances are we are going to have yet another rigged election. Tragic, isn't it? And the consequences of failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections is that Zimbabwe is a failed state. And as a failed state, the Zimbabwe economy is in total meltdown. Total meltdown. We are blundering from pillar to post. Mnangagwa is promising all this vision 2030. It's just a mirage. Nothing will be delivered. Zimbabwe has got the highest inflation rate. No country has ever enjoyed meaningful economic recovery, much less prospered, when it has got more than 2-digit rate of inflation? None. Name one country out there that ever prospered. None. And yet our rate of inflation is now getting on to what? 2,000%. 4 digits. During Mugabe's time, in 2008, we peaked at 500 billion%. It was impossible to do any meaningful business with that kind of rate of inflation. There was nothing in the shops, and no one could do or sell anything, because with that kind of inflation, there is no point in doing any meaningful business. But people still had to live. And so they had to somehow struggle. And yet somebody's talking of Zimbabwe is going to grow and achieve upper middle income status in 2030, when our inflation is sitting at 2,000%. That's just nonsense. Detail matters, and we need to pay attention. We really need, as a people, we need to sit up and start paying attention. If we don't, we are not going to get out of this hole that Mnangagwa and his sidekick, MDC CCC, have landed us into. That is the truth. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.